Welcome to panel 3 of Literature Colloquium 2021. Our final session this afternoon is entitled "Over the Door Was a Sign That Said Verse, Signs at the Border." As you would have seen, let me say I'm Professor Brideoake from the Literature Department, and it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I wasn't, as Professor Bent said, anticipating chairing this session, but Professor Berry is down with a terrible stomach bug, and so sends apologies, and I'm delighted to be here in her place. As you would know, our 4 presentations around which our conversation is to circle this afternoon come from David Pike, Fernanda Pérez, Alejandro Hirsch Saed, and Nikolai Razumov. And I, unless anyone has particular objections, would like to simply open our discussion to if anyone present would like to open with a particular question. Let's perhaps do so first in person before turning to the written questions that we also have on the Google document. And to which you can again submit comments at any time, as well as in the chat.
Just because I'm eating,
Yes.
I'm happy to have any of my questions read if you think any of them would be useful for starting, but I'm also happy to wait. Either way is fine.
Terrific,
but,
David. Should we let you eat?
No, as I said, I don't mind talking with my mouth full as long as nobody has to see me.
Okay, I understand. I mean, there are so many ways to put these various presentations in conversation and in conversation with our novella. I was struck by the return to in all of the presentations to this idea that Fernanda particularly brought out, this idea of the border condition, of a space or a place not defined or not defined merely by its juridical or geographic location, but a space and also a concept of exchange, of dialogue, of conflict, something other than the fact or the a priori of a border. And yeah, might that be a place for us to start? I know, David, in your paper, you invited us to think about metaphorics of traversal, and I was wondering how your thinking around these metaphors might have shifted or deepened as particular pressure was put on them in some of the other papers, or particular attention was drawn to this idea of the activity of the border, the action of the border, one might say.
No, that's a good question and a hard question. I did miss the middle section because I had to teach, so I don't know what happened in that conversation. Part of it is sort of I suppose there's so many different ways of thinking about crossing that, to me, that's why in my video I started with the idea of a people for whom the border doesn't exist, yes, but for whom the border condition does exist, because the border exists in a material sense and that it has to be crossed, and there are negotiations in crossing it and in maintaining a legal status of being able to cross the border. This is the Tona Odom people, and I'm sure other groups that live, indigenous groups that live on the border. So for me, the condition of crossing is both a condition that, like a metaphor, that both exists and doesn't exist at the same time. And that it works in both sides at once. And we were talking this morning about this, what Lily called, I think, a dialectical tension, this sort of tension between those two things. And for me, that's what a metaphor does. So metaphor is not, it's a carrying over, but when you carry something over, you for a metaphor to work, you have to keep what you're carrying, right? Yes. Yes. So you're basically, it's existing in two places at once. And I thought of that in Cole's image of the first story is a story literally of emergence, from one place into another that in a sense retains both states and for which the border doesn't exist, but there's another kind of border. So for me, the metaphorical state, like the carrying over and like a translation, the translation, there's alienation in going from a Harchar to verse, but there's also a retention of what was there. And so for me, the question is in how you maintain both of those things together at the same time, which is, I think, a lot of what we're talking about. How do you keep track of that that embodiment and the journey that Fernanda is talking about, while also attending to, or in Lily's language, dwelling on the fact that there's also, for instance, there's a materiality, there's a physicality there. How do you hold those two things together? And also, in a metaphor, what you want to think about is what emerges from the metaphorical joining of these two things. What emerges from the thinking of them together, which is what a metaphor does. It's not one thing or the other, but it's whatever emerges from the metaphor.
Yeah.
So I guess that's how I was thinking about it. Yeah. That
kind of convergence. Yeah. Fernanda, might I ask you to if you could say more? I'm thinking in particular about, I don't have the names of questioners here in the Google Doc, but the questioner who asks about, following on from the previous question, about this idea of putting more pressure on your fascinating account of this idea of moving from thinking of the border as a spatialized fact to something that is embodied, and that in Professor Pike's terms, like moves between metaphor and materiality, between, you know, is imbricated within this kind of traversal.
Yeah, I think that a good starting point for that is, you know, I think that we have a tendency to think about things in dichotomous terms, or we have a tendency to compartmentalize things. So we get this idea that we need to move between, like you said, move between the metaphor and the material. But if we stop thinking, as I argue in my presentation, about the border as the starting point, then we're not constrained by what we already think the border is, what we think that, you know, the border can be a lot of things to a lot of different people. But if we stop thinking of that as the starting space and think of our transformation that happens because of the border as the starting point, then it makes sense that there are no definitions for these terms, you know, that the metaphor and the material can interact in very different ways. And I think that a perfect way to exemplify this is actually with the responses that I got when I asked the people from my hometown in El Paso, Texas, about what was the first word that came to their minds when I told them about the border. And, you know, it's impressive that there are some people that will say family, and some people will say violence. Some people will say unity, and some people will say dichotomy. And so how do we kind of make all these things make sense together by not thinking of the space as the point where we start? We're able to accommodate different dwellings and different metaphors for the border if we think about the transformations, if we think about what happened so that this person thinks about the border as family. What transformation did they go through, and not just them, but their family, for them to think about the border like that? And then we can ask the same question to the person who said violence, and we get a completely different answer, but we are still accounting for the metaphor and the material at the same time, is what I would offer up as a starting point.
That's very thoughtful. That makes me want to, I guess, put a pin in the reminder again in the Google document of the centrality of that haunting figure in Nikolai's presentation of the pregnant woman, this seeming embodiment of new life, of transformation imagined as futurity, that is then shown to be that of putrefaction, of decay, of loss. And a point that really resonated with me, Alejandro, in your presentation, the idea of what happens when we think of the person who crosses the border merely in a kind of hypostasized sense as a migrant. So let me say that before I forget it. But in the meantime, David, I see your hand up.
Well, I wanted to respond, and I expect I'm going to age myself as someone who went to grad school during post-structuralism's heyday. But for me, I agree with basically everything you said, Fernanda. But I also observe that your starting point is still the border, right? Which is, your question is, what do you think of when you think of the border? So in some way, how do you, accepting what you're suggesting as the premise of where we want to be, which is not to be defined by that condition as the starting point. Yet the language still somehow requires you, in order to find the alternative structure, it still requires you to start with asking your question about the border, if that makes sense. So to me, there's a quandary there, which is sort of the post-structuralist quandary of, since we're constrained by a certain kind of language, how do we work? Is there a way of stepping outside of that, or do we have to find ways of working within those constraints, which is, in a sense, somehow, do we have to accept some form of the border in order to talk about the border condition? Or, as we want, is there another way of getting there? And I suppose you could also add, is Herrera suggesting one possible way, some ways of doing that?
Fernando.
Yeah. I think that the reason that I asked that question in the way that I did to the people that I did is because the people that live on the border already know that the border does not mean one thing. So it's different. Like if I'm talking here, I don't know how many people have lived or constantly interacted with the border. And so I think that when people are coming to the Herrera novel from outside the border, there's very different questions to ask than if I'm asking people that literally grew up crossing the border every day. I don't have to tell them that the starting point isn't the border, because their lived experiences already make that the norm, if that makes sense. So I think that the language, I think that Herrera very much is trying to get us away from what we usually come to conversations about the border with. We usually already come with certain things we want to talk about. We want to talk about immigration. We want to talk about the United States. We want to talk about Mexico. We want to talk, but the way that he does not give us places, he does not give us names of almost any characters. I think we get 3. And I think he's trying to get us away from that. And that's because he knows that he's not writing for people that grew up, especially on the border. This is a huge novel. It became super successful. So he knew, I think, that it wouldn't be only people from the border that would be reading it.
And that perhaps also reminds us of, I'm thinking back to David's sort of questioning of whether we are reimposing a kind of a binary or a fixity to this reminder that in this novel of constant movement, that sense of that we could perhaps ask whether that constant traversal, as well as Makina's resistance to that seemingly archetypal narrative of crossing the northern border with the desire to stay, maybe also destabilizes that presumption of this binary of a United States on one side and a Mexico on the other side, and individuals who belong to either of those two spaces in ways, it sounds like, Fernanda, you're emphasizing that the kind of lived experience of the border is something far more, the border and the identities of those, rather like in the work of Anzaldúa, as far more complicated, as far more hybrid. Alejandro.
Yeah, going off of that, I think one of the things that really helped me sort of think through that idea, and not necessarily starting with the border, is I was reading Felix Guattari, The Three Ecologies, and one of the things that he talks about is this part of technology, like ecology more than just the environment, but technology, politics, and the environment. And in a certain way, it creates this relationship that we see between sort of Makina's exteriority and subjectivity, and sort of what she's trying to do well, what the novel is trying to tell us about this crossing, not only like physical crossing, but more like this travel, this trip to the US, or, well, in my presentation, I talk a little bit about Mictlan or Hell, which then, I mean, and it sort of ties in together of this idea of death as not something final, which I think in the idea of the border, if we sort of some of the imagery of the crosses on the border wherever someone has been killed, or this whole idea of lack of communication and return, it's I think the problem here becomes more, well, not necessarily a problem, but it's sort of there's so many things going on and so many forces impacting this and creating this crisis in the border, that I think that's why we sort of also rely on the metaphor, or rely on the travel through hell, because there's and well, it makes me think of Benjamin too, when he says in The Storyteller, that is the sanction of everything that the storyteller can tell. He has borrowed his authority from death. In other words, it is natural history to which his stories refer back. So I think this sort of Herrera in a certain way is referring to all these different types of stories: political, environmental, technological, personal, while at the same time not giving a like one perspective, but it giving space for every story to have its own, each border experience to be sort of different and metaphorical.
Thank you. Alejandro, if I might ask you to continue to elaborate. Jeff, in the questions in the Google document, noted the way in which your presentation picked up the resonances of the idea of the sinkhole, and which you were just talking about, not only kind of passages in and out of different realms of experience, but environmental questions. And I think that was also picked up in Nikolai's resonance, or his referencing to his references to the scenes of a almost dystopian kind of plenteous surfeit, the idea of the sheer bewildering excess of the American supermarket. That is, of course, one reason for the environmental end of the world that we find ourselves contemplating. So continuing on from what you just said, might I ask you to say more about your centering of the figure of the fact of, but also the figure of the sinkhole?
Yeah, I think the sinkhole, at least from my perspective while reading the novel, it sort of represents like these two things at the beginning, because it's sort of what McKinney is literally running away from, to not fall in, and then sort of the disappearance of these towns. And I think that's not limited to the space of the immediate border. But if we think of Mexico and even part of Central America as this border with the US, where entire towns have tried to move to the north, and then the sinkhole is sort of this disappearance of that space, where when we see it environmentally is much more striking, and it like takes the material to, but once we think of it as more of, once the people are gone, the town literally starts sinking, everything starts decaying. So and that's sort of why I like to think of Herrera's, and not necessarily the border itself as a starting point, but this idea of Mexico, the whole country, as a border to the US in a certain way, and then towns in Central America that are losing people constantly because of local violence, and then people leaving. I think in that way, sort of that this environmental crisis, that what I would say it's ecological, it includes everything from the violence, the politics, and the loss of the people, while also having a real argument on the ecological impact of the border, of a border wall, of a border, of that striking difference of architecture and buildings and stuff from one side to the other. In this, I try to point out in parts of my video, like these points where you see the line from the top and you can see sort of the decaying town on one side and then like freeways on the other side.
Yeah, we might also think of the accounts of not only the geopolitical implications of a kind of Trumpian border imagined as a physical obstacle, but accounts of the environmental damage, as well as obviously the humanitarian damage of that. Yeah, thank you. David, I see your hand up.
Yes. So this I'm thinking also, not only am I an ancient post-structuralist, but also an ancient materialist, even though those two things are, I guess I have to hold them dialectically together since you can't be both. But I was thinking again about, well, the larger question that that I'm wrestling with, and why I find these conversations so incredibly fascinating is, in other words, can we have the kind of conversation we're having without some kind of a space to ground it in? And then when we ground it in a space, that materiality, and so in one sense, the space is Herrera's book. In another sense is the space we keep coming back to, which is Mexico, US, even though he's also telling us, as I agree, that we're not there. And I was thinking about this in your comments, Alejandro, because of the sinkhole, because the sinkhole in the what I've heard, because I was, believe it or not, on a session with some anthropologists and geologists, one of whom does their research on sinkholes in Central America. This is not only a metaphor about the drain of immigration, but it's also, the metaphor comes from a material phenomenon which is happening especially in Central America and Mexico, because of specific geological reasons having to do primarily with various kinds of resource extraction and other things. And so therefore, it does localize. So even though he doesn't say where it's happening, for somebody who knows that history, as you probably do, it localizes it in a certain way. And this goes back to Fernanda's point about, what you know as someone who's somewhere locally and what you know as somebody who's reading it from outside. So it's both a metaphor and not a metaphor. It's actually, as you showed us with the photographs in your video, this is a common enough occurrence, even though it also has a figurative meaning within the novel. And so I'm sort of both pressing us to remember to figure, how do we deal with the material part of that metaphor, with where the metaphor starts. The metaphor expresses what we're just trying to talk about, but that physicality, that materiality of the actual sinkholes that are happening in these places is also somehow there. And what I'm wrestling with, how do we keep these things in the air at the same time? Like, how do they speak to each other? And how do we attend to each of them or dwell on each of them at the same time, I guess?
And we might say that the density or the multiplicity of that, I mean, it would be incorrect to say the metaphorics of that. I mean, when you said that the idea of geological instability brought about by a particular kind of resource extraction, thinking about that in conversation with Alejandro's emphasis upon the extraction of, dare we call it, human capital. I mean, again, that the palimpsest of different extractive economies is really powerful and haunting. Yeah. Fernanda, I see your hand up. You might need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, my microphone was not working. So I think that it's an interesting question to ask, if we can have these discussions without the space that is the border. Because I think that actually gets perfectly to something that I talk about in my presentation, which is that a lot of the knowledge creation that we have had coming from the border takes the border as the site of this creation of knowledge, right? Ansaldúa, Morriaga, they need this border, this place of tension to create knowledge. And I think that by default, then we're also saying that if we were to not have the border, if we were to abolish borders, then we would be losing knowledge, that we would be where in reality the border has for a really long time symbolized the loss of indigenous knowledge, the loss of indigenous ways of knowing and ways of being. So then if we're going to ask the question of if we can have these discussions without the space, then I think we should also ask what discussions we've been missing out on because of that space. And I think that also shows us that they don't need to be grounded in our space. We talk about metaphor. How do we make sense of all the other things that we don't know how to make sense of? Through metaphor. And so I think that there's a lot of value in looking beyond the space and to the metaphor, and to come up with, a lot of people will have different metaphors. Like you'll have a different metaphor for a certain situation. How do I explain the border to somebody that's never been there? Through metaphor. I don't need, because I have the lived experience, but that doesn't mean I need the space. So I think that there's a lot of ways there. I just think it's hard to figure out, definitely.
Thank you. Yes. Jeff, I see your hand up.
So I was actually going to call attention to Fernanda's basically, she went through all of this, and the only thing I want to add here is in terms of responding to David, how do we actually get through this? Her piece actually gives us the language that Herrera gives us too, and I'll punt this back to Fernanda if you want, because you make this convincing argument that we should not refer to this as the border, but the border situation. And that actually takes it out of the place in some ways, which I find a really interesting strategic move. I don't know if you want to talk about that more or I invite you to talk about that more, like in why that language can be valuable.
Can you repeat the first half of the question, because it cut out, and then I just heard you say, "Can you talk about that more?" And then I was like, "Wait, what am I talking about?"
So does this work a little bit better? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Sometimes does not. What I was going to say in terms of it, merely I was adding into, I was going to direct this to you, Fernanda, in terms of the language, that this is in response to Professor Pike saying, what do? We need this language of the border and dealing with the physical space and the material space of the border. But you, through Herrera, actually give us an alternative to this. You give us the idea of the border situation, which sort of de-emphasizes the physical space, which is, which we were talking about this a little bit in panel 1. I know that Lily and Lindsay are in the room here also in terms of our discussion of infrastructure and how those, sort of contribute, and yet there's a tension between the physical space and humanity in those particular ways. I found your use of the term or of border situation really really compelling. And I was inviting you to talk to us more about border situations as opposed to borders.
Yes. Okay, got it now. So I think that the way that Herrera used that term, and this term was actually mentioned in an interview. I don't even know if he meant to make up a term or something, but when he says border condition, then we're talking, I think we're talking about the condition created by the border, right? We're not talking about the border anymore. And a condition, something has to be in that condition. And it could be the space, the space can be in the border condition, but so can a person. So can a dead body, like we saw in the book. And that means something. That condition implies a lot of other things. And I think that condition is the way into the metaphor that we've been saying might be the way to move beyond this language. I think the condition, when we talk about a condition, I'm going to take, for example, to maybe lead us into the question about the woman that was dead on the border. Her condition of death implied with it also the condition of the border, but we're all familiar with the condition of death. We all have different conceptualizations of it, but we're all familiar with it. And so I think that that's the perfect lens to look at it is that like, here is this thing. It could be a person, it could be a space, it could be a line on the ground, it could be anything else, and it is in this condition. What does that mean, and what does it evoke from me? Would I think be how I would add on to that.
That's really suggestive. Alejandro.
Yeah, and I mean, going from this idea of the metaphor and death that Fernanda was talking about, I think it's really interesting to think of it in two ways. One, as Walter Benjamin is talking about it, as all the great storytellers have in common the freedom with which they move up and down the rungs of the experience as on a ladder extending downward to the interior of the earth and disappearing into the clouds is the image for a collective experience to which even the deepest shock of every individual experience, death, constitutes no impediment of barrier. And I think that's sort of the interesting way that the novel uses death as not something terminal, but actually something that's constant. And then if we think of Mictlán, what it had, the Aztec hell, is that each circle was like suffering, but every three circles was sort of a death, another death. The first one is crossing the river, which is sort of feeling drowning. To enter Mictlán, just like entering the Greek hell or even Dante, that going through the Styx, well, here you have to go through a river, which in this case is also going through the Rio Grande, right? The Rio Bravo. And then it's you move, like when she's shot by the officer, that aligns with the circle of hell. There's a circle of Aztec hell that there's air knives attacking you constantly, right? And you're dying constantly from these knives that are hitting you. So it's sort of what I find fascinating in this is that Herrera is not only using the metaphor of death as this crossing, as this loss of a lot of things, but he's also using all these other conceptions of what we know as hell and as this process of dying to take us out of that space that we're talking about in a certain way. Keeps us in this border imaginary, but it's sort of, and I think this goes also to David's presentation and I'm thinking of the video and how we see these different environments through the border. It's not like there's sinkholes everywhere, everything is desert or everything is river or everything. It's sort of, that would be like saying that the US is the same from California to Texas, right? And well, just to close out this idea of death as this metaphorical space in Mictlán, there's this part where Mictlán, the souls at the end, after they go through the 9 parts, they don't stay there. It's a regenerative sort of thing. It's more of a purgatory than an actual hell. So, and I think that sort of connects to Makina's question at the end of this possibility of grabbing a new identity, of latching onto something new.
And again, as so many of these comments have circled back to this idea of a kind of being, like an ontology of process or movement or traversal, something that isn't essentialized, and not essentialized in the way that, again, I think you really powerfully noted, Alejandro, in your presentation, the kind of the limitation of thinking of reducing an individual according to the status of their citizenship or otherwise into something seemingly fixed. The immigrant, the settler, the crosser of the border who is assumed to be moving only unidirectionally in a way that Makina complicates. Yeah, thank you.
If I can just reply to Professor Noble's question really quickly.
Yes.
So from my understanding of Mictlán, the Aztec myth is that sort of you're already dead, but then you have to experience different forms of death while going through it. It's sort of like and it's not a static place. It's not sort of like you go to one realm of hell, like in Dante's hell. You have to sort of transverse to it, go through it, and I don't know, it's sort of similar in many ways, but also pretty unique into, and that's your thing, not everyone goes to Mictlan in the Aztec myth. Warriors go to another place, women that die in childbirth go to another place, but the general sort of the main population has to experience different forms of that. So I think that's what makes the immigrant too. But.
David, I see your hand up.
Yes, so yeah, and if I start to sound stuck, please just send me a chat to say, yeah, let's move on from this conversation. So I've been thinking about this, especially in terms of, so in a belief system, so say if we don't call the Aztec myth, but we call the Aztec an indigenous belief system, there is no metaphor, right? And what you're saying is that in a sense, it's a belief system that expresses the, as Fernando would put it, the condition of the fact that one is always in death in one's life. So that in that sense, when Herrera uses it in the framework, we're talking about it as if it's a metaphor in the novel. But if we're talking about it as if it's a metaphorical framework for the novel, then my question has to be, well, what's the beginning of the metaphor? And I'm not a good enough a rhetorician to remember what traditional rhetoricians call the start. I never forget if it's the ground of the metaphor is to me the best thing to call it, since that's where I always start, with the ground. But if you're thinking of it in terms of a belief system, or I think a condition, as Fernanda seems to be suggesting, as Herrera seems to also be suggesting, then we shouldn't be talking about it as a metaphor. We should be talking about it. We should have some other language to talk about it. Similarly to the origin story that I talk about, that Teju Cole talks about at the beginning of my, and I quote at the beginning of my video. This is not a metaphor for something else. This is, in a sense, this is part of a journey. This is a description of a journey, I suppose would be the way to put it, again, in Fernanda's terms. So again, I don't know how we shift the terms of our discussion to register that fact in Herrera's novel. I don't also know if the novel is capable as a form of expressing a belief system as opposed to writing metaphors, which goes back to my post-structuralist assumption about language before. But it's worth thinking about it, at least attending to the difference between a belief system in which metaphor is not present, because the two things are the same, literally the same, which is what faith tells you. And when you take something on faith, you are refusing the metaphorical ground. It simply is. Versus what most of us are doing, which is thinking about, and how most of us live in an academic context like this, which is talking about how we can hold two registers together at the same time. If that makes sense, as a sort of as two ways of having the conversation that we're having, in a sense, two modes of knowledge, I suppose, might be another way of thinking about it.
And how we might think of those epistemologies or worldviews, or however we might term them, as I'm not sure if coextensive is the best term, but synchronous or simultaneous, rather than canceling one, like moving away from a presumption of a kind of paradigm shift in which an Aztec epistemology becomes a myth in the retrospective figuration of it. Yeah. Other questions and observations? I have a question here from Professor Noble to Fernanda, but I also know we have many other people here that I invite to join in this really stimulating discussion. Fernanda, was that a hand up?
Yeah, I just
Yes,
wanted
please.
to kind of respond a little bit to Professor Pike's idea that like a metaphor needs a starting place. If I understood that correctly, that like something needs to be real for us to later create a metaphor for it. I think that that's interesting, because I think that while it is true that we often think about things like that, I would like to invoke Patricia Hill Collins here and her work on intersectionality, when she says that many people think of metaphors as literary devices that are confined to fiction and essays. A metaphor, however, can spark an instant sense of understanding, fostering an immediate sense of the formerly unknown in terms of the known. In essence, the capacity to think and act is metaphorical in nature. So I would say that, yeah, we need language to express metaphors, but the way that we think, our epistemology, the way we actually change paradigms, like from this epistemology to this one, or how we fuse them together, how epistemologies interact, I would argue is metaphorical in nature. And, I don't think that there needs to be a starting point as long as there's a dialogue between the metaphors. So it's like, if there is a common understanding, if I'm talking to you about something that you have no idea about, but you're responding to me and I'm communicating it with a metaphor. If you understand the metaphor, that's what matters. And I think that Herrera's book actually shows us that, because the metaphor is everything that happens between I'm dead and I'm ready. And so the book is confusing. There's a lot of things that a lot of us, I think, didn't understand. But we understood the metaphor. We understood that this was a liminal space that was full of transformation. And I think that's what matters, not necessarily what metaphors we use or where they may be grounded.
That's really interesting. Could you put the quote in the chat? Because I haven't heard that before, and it's fascinating, and I haven't thought it from those terms. I suppose in the terms I was using, what the person you quoted calls the known would be what I'm calling the ground. Normally, and another way, I think from your sense, I hear you defining it in terms of kind of relationality. For that relationality to work, for there to be a shared understanding of the metaphor, it feels that there has to be at least some sense of the ground. But I think what you're saying is that if people are coming from different ground or different known things, they can meet in the space of the metaphorical part. But I guess the way I see it is that they still need their own ground in order for the metaphor to work, even if they're basically understanding the metaphor differently in terms of where they come from. There's still the two parts are still somehow generating that space. And so another way of thinking about it is, for me, it still feels necessary to understand that. Although I'm also hearing you that maybe attending to what's happening in that other space, in that shared metaphorical moment, may be more important at this time, which is what I guess you're also saying, that maybe I should stop worrying so much about the different grounds.
If I wonder, correct me if I'm wrong, Fernanda, but it also seemed as if you were interested in getting away from, or troubling the way in which I think perhaps language of ground or origin point reproduces a kind of teleology, or a kind of a progress narrative in which we get back to thinking about the border as a place of
exactly
two nations, one of which its inhabitants want to leave behind or supersede, or an epistemology that we assume is less civilized and therefore is myth. Or please say more.
Exactly, because I think that the concept of a border is so deeply rooted in dichotomy that to get away from that, you need to get away from the border, because our world is made up of borders, and we live in a reality where that is just a truth that we have internalized. And so to start at the space is to start with those dichotomies, and getting away from that, if we start at the space, is really hard. If we start in the in-between, which is Herrera's book, it's the whole journey. And I would argue that the journey is not to cross the border, the journey is to find her brother, which so happens to cross the border. If her brother would have been in El Gran Chilango, she would have gone there. But so I think that in-between is what Herrera's book is and offers up.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Alejandro.
Yeah, and I think there's a part too where, and I think this is why the use of metaphor in Herrera is so fascinating. I remember the first time I read this book was 2 years ago or something in Professor Miden's class. And I entered from a really different perspective into a metaphor, right? Like, we were talking about borders specifically, we were talking about globalization, but then what I think is fascinating is sort of how this metaphor, and I think it's in part the space of, not the space, but the border as an idea, the border as more than just the physical space that allows for this metaphor to keep growing and to keep sort of different points of entry, right? Like, if you're familiar with the Aztec myth, then you might enter from there. If you're talking from an environmental studies perspective, you can enter from the sinkholes into the metaphor. If you're talking about, I'm trying to think, like immigration, it's completely different than, and I think there's also the last part, which is what fascinates me the most, and I think it's what makes this story so efficient in a certain way, is the focus on the personal story, on the specific, on this specific story that in a way it's dislocated because it's not tied to, it's yes tied to this idea of the border, because we cannot say it's not tied to the idea of the border in a certain way, but it's dislocated in the sense that it's a space that there's so many forces, external and internal, affecting it, than the person, the individual, is kind of dislocated or lost, or in the sense of solitude, that then in a weird way, this journey, in Makina's case, gives her a second opportunity, but not necessarily locates her back, right? There's the physical place sort of becomes lost in, and I think that's to what I mean, what I found fascinating about Fernanda's presentation. That's in part.
Yeah, and again, how that decenters the presumption that that the potential, the would-be immigrant on the southern border only has, there is only one story, there is only one direction, there is only one, and there is a journey which is presumed to have an endpoint, and that endpoint being this aspirational space of the United States in which its plenitude is not that of is figured very differently to the the violences of the desert, the violences of the almost monstrous surfeit of the supermarket. Yeah. Fernando, if I have a question here that Professor Noble put in the chat a while back, but I think it speaks to both what you and Alejandro were just talking about, and in conversation with David about this idea of unsettling or putting pressure on the facticity of the border. Professor Noble asks you to clarify what you thought were the limitations of the kind of knowledge described by Moraga and Zaldúa. And it struck me as perhaps a good place to ask this, given their foundation and role in thinking about the border as a hybrid space, as something other than a kind of static, merely geopolitical demarcation.
Yes, definitely. I'm going to pull up the quotes real quick, just so I can have them in front of me, and I will answer. Okay, perfect. So on Zaldúa, if we consider the quotes that I presented in my video, Zaldúa talks about the border as an open wound, una herida abierta, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. So, and from this bleeding, from this scarring, from this hemorrhaging, there is a lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. And if we put that right next to Cherria Moraga's work, where she says, I'm a woman with a foot in both worlds, and I refuse the split. I feel the necessity for dialogue. Basically, these two authors do an exceptional job at theorizing the liminality of the border and the non-space that it is. But at the same time, they kind of predicate their knowledge on this friction, on the split, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that if we understand the space itself, the border, the friction, the bleeding as a place of birth for new knowledge, then we are in a way neglecting the fact that its existence destroys knowledge as well. And so the I would say, like, the idea that they have is right, but I think it would be better served if they took it one step back and understood their transformation, their liminality as a person, the liminality of their community, of their family, of the interactions and relationships that they have experienced. If they took that as a starting point and created knowledge from those relationships, from those communities, then I think that it would be more, I don't want to use the word productive, but answering a question on the spot, so productive is the first word that comes to mind. But I think it would be more productive than focusing the birth of knowledge from a split creating dialogue, from friction creating dialogue, from the border creating dialogue. Because although the border can be an avenue for dialogue, I don't think it is the border that creates knowledge. I mean, that creates the dialogue. I think it's the transformations that people experience through the border that create the dialogue.
And that's interesting. I mean, that the, what is so arresting about that idea of worlds grating against one another, of the metaphorics of that friction, that corporeality imagined, like literalized in that image of the wound and of bleeding and healing, of scabbing over and coagulation. I mean, it's exactly. almost it's almost like that metaphor is doing too much work. It's so arresting, it's so shocking that I think that speaks to the kind of potential overdetermination that you're trying to resist in
yes, especially
in pushing back.
Because it's very visual, and that visual carries with it the violence that the border often carries with it, but it also kind of implies that from that violence comes knowledge, from that wound then we create knowledge, and I just resist the idea that the violence is a necessity for the creation of knowledge.
That's helpful. And I think there's something also really useful about sort of attending to, but also complicating what in some ways have, since their publication, rather ironically become kind of, if we might say, canonical accounts, like marginal accounts that have become in their descriptive, in their analytic centrality, in some ways unable to be challenged. And so I commend your thoughtfulness in putting them into question. Yeah, David.
So yeah, I found that again, and I'm hoping also to bring Nikolai into the conversation, because he in his presentations, you in your presentation, you spoke about this, Nikolai, is the moment where we see that, where in a sense, Makina's vision, her journey of the world seems to, for a moment, slip away into something that looks more like the kind of metaphors that Anzaldúa and Moraga that you quote, as a rotting corpse, which is a classic border imaginary image. And it's almost as if that's the one moment in the novel where Herrera is into that sort of traditional border narrative that he has avoided everywhere else. We can't ask the question of whether or not that's an intentional choice or whether he slipped, though that's one way of thinking about it. But I do think it's worth trying to think about how that moment works within the rest of the novel, if you agree with me that does feel like a moment where we're not in that unusual sort of liminal space where everything else is happening. And I took your reading where you sort of said that we just sort of see this, we can sort of see this as a moment of somebody else's journey, but especially in the weight that it took on in both in Jaden's presentation as well, in Jaden choosing this for image, and Nikolai thinking of that moment as well, it feels like it takes on a weight within the fiction. And so I'm curious to hear both Nikolai and anyone else speak a little bit more about how that moment is working within the rest of the form or the framework of the novel.
Nikolai, please.
Sure. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I'm sorry I popped in kind of late, but from what I came in, there were like a lot of good observations, and I really want to watch this later. But that scene with the body under the tree, that part stuck out to me, not only because it was so like such evocative imagery, but also because it definitely did feel like it carried a different type of weight in it than like the rest of the story. Like, I think because it was such a physical representation, like, I don't know, like for me, like something that really stood out throughout the whole book was how Makina seems a little bit, I don't want to say that she's free from harm, because she does go through harm and she goes through a lot of like trials, but she almost seems more observant rather than like experiencing some of the more like the events or things that can like tie people to places. She's more of like a moving part, whereas that was a very physical, like grounding part in the story that, I don't know, it definitely did seem to be like a really big contrast. But I'd like to hear what other people had to say about that scene specifically too.
I'm wondering, thinking of your comments, Nikolai, and yours, David, about the reminder of that as a you know, the figuration of the corpse, as we might also say, like the abandoned, the empty canister of water, or the sort of the tropes of a particular narrative of the brutality and the tragedy of the border, the degree to which we find those explicable, you know, the degree to which we move towards them as sort of evocative potentially of the problem of a text like American Dirt, the kind of the appetite for a certain kind of narrative of suffering, that of violence, and of a figuration of Mexico and Central America as occupying a kind of parallel moral universe, and these stories that are, of which there's a dismaying appetite for. Like, I guess just more an observation, thinking about the place of the place in a more popular discourse of a more mainstream discourse of kind of literatures of the border. Fernanda, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think to the question, or like the debacle of whether Herrera slipped and like let his preconceptions about the notion, about the border, like the ideas he already has, into the book, or whether it was intentional. I think I would say that it doesn't matter. I think that it actually just speaks to the unavoidability of these narratives that we have surrounding the border, and how even if he didn't mean to write it and he slipped, then like that just goes to show you how it's a part of his conceptualization of the border by default. And and if he was writing this book that was trying so hard to get away from it, and he still did it by accident, then like, what does that say about us? And if it was on purpose, then it might have been a sign of him telling us, like, you have to look at these narratives at some point to look away from them eventually. So
that makes me think of David, you wrestling with these questions of materiality versus post-structuralism. In what way does the border write these overdetermined tropes?
So my follow-up question very quickly, because I see I jumped in front of two people, would be then, if it is somehow unavoidable, how do we address it in a way that is going to limit that inevitability? The way you might talk about bias. If bias is going to be inevitable, how do we how do we do it in such a way that we're limiting what it does in the other conversations?
I think I would answer that with just the concept of verse, you know, like you have to move through something to ever move like beyond, to ever think about the possibility of moving beyond it, you know. So if we're going to talk about narratives about the border, we must first acknowledge how our narratives have been so rooted in the space of the border to ever think about moving beyond the space of the border.
That feels helpful. Jeff.
Sorry, give me a moment. I'm trying to find the place where I was.
Of course. As you find your place, Jeff, Alejandro, might I ask you to jump in?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is fascinating where we're getting with this conversation. And I think these like preconceptions of border narratives and all these moments in the book were sort of the metaphor kind of like almost breaks, right? But it never actually, sort of like these moments of tension. In a way, I think that this resonates so much too, because it allows us to, there's sort of like this tension of breaking from the metaphor, because then I don't think many of us can actually relate to the border without the metaphor, can relate to this space without it, can relate but cannot think about it more than just in regular terms or simple terms, isn't it? And I'm thinking of these too because, so for another project I did a survey of several works on the border. One was Mael Vizcarra's documentary on border merchants in Tijuana on the La Línea, which sort of, she's just walking around and filming people, but there's no metaphor, right? It's just really physical. And then I was thinking also of Carne y Arena by Alejandro González Iñárritu, which is this VR experience of full embodiment, right? You're barefooted, all you see and feel it's this VR experience where you walk in with the set, everything, and you walk in barefoot into this sort of desert, and then you see these images. And then there's a moment where if you walk into one of the other people you're seeing, you can feel their heartbeat. What I'm trying to get with this is sort of, I went to that experience twice, right? The first time I didn't go into anybody else's, and I was just observing, and again, there was no metaphor, it was just like this intense, violent experience for a moment. But then once you go into the metaphor, into the heartbeat, into the more, and I think this again goes back to Benjamin, of this aspect of sacrificing truth for storytelling, or in a way fantasizing, in a way, again, I think like this text is so efficient is because even though it seems that it's going to break from that metaphor, it doesn't actually break, and it lets us like relate to it in a way that just coming at the border from a different, from like an outside perspective, from just watching the news, would never allow us.
And that, I mean, the idea of the particularity of that misapprehension, if we're to sort of return to this question of why this inevitability, why this recursion of this seemingly overdetermined trope, the fact that the misapprehension of the corpse is that of the of a pregnant woman. If we again think of the familiarity of the narrative of coming to America for a better life, suffering for your children, risking everything, you know, traversal and its existential dangers as a kind of self-sacrifice to a future generation. I mean, I think if you were to, you know, regardless of where you came down in these questions of, I don't want to call them intentionality, but it seems perhaps not accidental that the recursion of this figure was so particular. was imagined in such an identifiable kind of way, in a way that has such a resonance with, again, these familiar narratives of why the border is traversed in the first place. Lily, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for this really, really generative conversation. And this is kind of getting me thinking about multiple things. Fernanda, I really loved your rethinking of Anzaldúa and Moraga, and this kind of rethinking in terms of overdetermination. And I was thinking about so much of this conversation has been focused so much on the kind of materiality of space, right? But from what I'm hearing from you, which I thought was really fascinating, is that you add a temporal element to the rethinking of Anzaldúa and Moraga, right? Like, so you ask us to take one step back, right? And thinking in terms of, and in that stepping back, kind of really rethinking the teleology, going to Fiona's point, right? Of this kind of the presumed origin and destination, right? Of which we want to go in terms of imagining the parameters, right? Dare I say, of decolonization, right? And so, I mean, this is the thing, right? Like it goes into the question of, and this goes into Nikolai's video, right? Like if we think about death as not an endpoint, right? As an added life cycle, right? This goes into the mythology work that Alejandro was talking about, right? And this is like, to me, is interesting whenever I teach Tuck and Yang's piece, Decolonization is not a metaphor. You know, I always think it's like, you know what, decolonization seems like a metaphor today only because we can't envision it, but it could be material in the future, right? It's a question about temporality and dimension, right? So I wonder if you all wanted to kind of jump in here, because I just wanted to add, because I just wanted to echo what Fernanda was talking about in her really, really, I think, brilliant rethinking of Anzaldúa and Moraga, and kind of thinking about the parameters of the flesh, right? That, like, you know, where do we even start and end the flesh? Where do we even start and end decolonization? When do we even start and end or envision, right, the ways in which metaphor gets materialized, right? In the moment in which, you know, Alejandro is bringing this up, like, unfortunately, our current condition is that most people enter the border through metaphor. But what if we can imagine a world in which decolonization is no longer has to be a metaphor for contact, right? That it can actually be a form of material forms of, going to kind of David's point, materiality. It is actually the space of the present. So yeah, I would love to hear more about that.
Fernanda and Alejandro, I see your hands up. Nikolai also, please, and David, jump in. And Ames and others.
Yeah. I mean, that piece, I did read it at some point, the decolonization is not a metaphor. And I think that, you know, because when we think of it as a metaphor, I think because of the associations we have with metaphor, that it's like, it's a literary device, it's not real, it's, but that doesn't mean it's not a way to get there, you know? So like metaphor, decolonization could be envisioned through metaphor, even if it's not a metaphor, because it's material, it's real, it has consequences. It is like, it will have bodily consequences on people, material consequences on people. But because in our reality, in our colonial reality, it is so hard to envision, I personally love to think of metaphor as a way to get there. And I think that's why this book just resonates so much with me, because I think that it is a fraction, an 80-page glimpse into a metaphor that could help us get there. I have more thoughts, but I want to hear with everybody.
Nikolai.
I think that Alejandro was before me, though. I don't want to go first. Are you sure?
I'm inviting you just because I know you couldn't join us earlier. We want to hear your voice.
So I don't know. I think that that's really interesting, and also like something that like really made me enjoy this book and made me think more. And I think I'm going to be thinking about this book for years, because of like, also with like the kind of open ending. Like that's why I love the end words, like when she says like she's ready, and she's kind of going on this place that we aren't really sure where she's going. And I think that throughout the book, Makina, like, there's this emphasis on her going back, which would mean that she would traverse a border again. But at the end, we're not really sure if that's her destination or what her destination is or what her goals are. And so it's like a very, like, the end of the book challenged my idea of where she was going, and it challenged what I originally thought were her desires, because it kind of, we aren't really entirely sure what her goals are, what her desires are, where she's going. So it's like, I don't know, it completely flipped where I thought that the narrative was going and what I thought that he was kind of, what Herrera was trying to say. And so that's why, like, this conversation is like making me aware of like different interpretations that I hadn't read it in my reading of the book before.
And I think that idea of that speaks to the work, the efficacy, dare I say, of the text, of that sense of it's returning us to this space, both material and metaphorical, but it's unsettling of, again, to use Lily's language, our presumptions about trajectory and teleology. Yeah. Alejandro, and then David.
Yeah, I think the other part of this material part of the metaphor, that I think is really interesting is, again, because the border has so many different experiences to the level that each individual experience is completely unique. For example, I feel like this book, in a sense, or I don't want to say this book, but certain narratives of the border, some people can enter through them without the necessity of a metaphor much more easily. Like, because there's the narrative of the immigrant that comes from Central America or other parts of Mexico and crosses, but there's also the narrative of the people that live in the border and cross all the time, or the people that never cross but leaving that edge. And just going off that, and sorry I keep going back to Benjamin, but I think like the storyteller says it really aligns well with this, is when he's talking about the novel, he says, the novel is significant, therefore, not because it presents someone else's fate to us, perhaps didactically, but because this stranger's fate, by virtue of the flame which consumes it, yields us the warmth which we never draw from our own fate. What draws the reader to the novel is the hope of warming his shivering life with a death he reads about. What I want to take out from this quote, I think it's this idea that, and this might be a little bit controversial, but I feel that a lot of people still feel the colonization and the violence it has produced as something too attractive to fight back. Like this obsession with this violence, this obsession with death, with this conflict. Like the idea of the border, I've been following, I always follow the border news, and like you see the rise of border news since Biden won in right-wing news sources to showcase that violence, to showcase that conflict. Even though for many people that live in the border, as Fernanda was saying, is not a place of conflict, of violence, but it's a place of unity. It's a place. So I think that sort of the metaphor works in a way where, I don't know, it can be material or it can be a metaphor, but it's sort of, the focus is more on, and I think this is the main challenge of decolonization too, is the fact that people actually enjoy the suffering and moving away and fighting back against that, and especially when a lot of the people that enjoy the suffering are the people in power, it sort of makes us stay in the metaphor in a certain way.
So I wanted to add two things, one shorter and one a little bit longer. The short one is to I was remembering hearing especially Lily talk about sort of temporality and moving beyond decolonization. When a metaphor stops being a metaphor, we call it a dead metaphor. So when metaphors, in a sense, enter into language as something that we stop recognizing as a metaphor. And so especially the way we've been talking about death during this day today, that resonated with me in terms of what we want to happen to our metaphors in the way we're talking today, which I felt was fascinating. The other thing that I was thinking about is I keep thinking about speculative fiction, and why speculative fiction is, in a sense, been taken up more and more as a decolonizing genre, and which makes even more sense to be now thinking of ways of getting out of a space-time, not in necessarily moving beyond it, but in a sense, moving around it. And I've been thinking a lot about Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony, which is not quite a border narrative, but it takes place very near the border, where it's not that you journey through the way out of the fatal narrative of imperialism and colonialism is by thinking beyond it, literally by being before it, after it, and neither before nor after it, but finding a narrative that, in a sense, which she finds in an indigenous story. And so to me, that's one way of thinking about it. And of course, speculative fiction is exactly where you can imagine what isn't real yet, where you, in a sense, can create a metaphorical space which has different rules, which are the rules you want to have happen, but which is, of course, also always, and you'll give me another word to use for grounded, because I'm not allowed to use grounded anymore, which is always grounded. I mean, speculative fiction only works if we recognize our world in it, right? It only works if there's something still recognizable. And the tension comes from, again, from the back and forth between what it shows us of something different and then what we recognize that we're stuck in. And so that, yeah, I can't get out of that back and forth, because that's where I think we all work, right? In that back and forth. So I'll stop there.
But with that yet that Lily so helpfully drew our attention to.
If I can jump in, there's a couple things to bring from the first panel this morning that might be worth coming in. Is this which would complicate, after having been so embracing of Fernanda's ideas of not necessarily locating these things in anything real, or rather to ground it, to use the word that David can't use. That there are ways in which during the panels this morning, we were talking a little bit about how Herrera does place language as the sort of stop markers in some ways, the very moments where he's using language that doesn't make sense. This is most evident in the word hauchar, or in the English verse, both work that way, that disrupt the narrative flow and therefore ground really the narrative in something mystical almost. The other part that we were talking about was with the names, Mr. H, but H spelled out instead of as the letter. Marianne pointed out how this was really an interesting sort of jolt, almost, to sort of jolt us back. How might metaphor work with this? The other thing I wanted to bring up, and this is a little bit unconnected, but not, and it's in what David's actually talked about with regard to genre and speculative fiction. Professor Dusser in the Q&A, then the set of questions, wanted to point out noir with this. But more than noir, one of the words which undoubtedly was on Herrera's list, he mentions all the words he didn't want to use to localize this. And clearly, one of the other words is narco, which we've avoided the entire day talking about. In some ways, we brought the border, but Alejandro's discussion of violence and Fernando bringing in mafia and all of these different elements, we haven't talked about the different specific noir-esque genres of narco literatura, which this could figure in. Certainly Herrera's other works actually figure into this, but this one almost resists it, and by resisting it, then calls attention to it in some ways. What's missing here is still there in some ways. Fernanda will probably take me to town now with this, which is good.
I actually was going to respond to Professor Wong, just add a little bit more on the Ansaldúa and Moraga discussion, but maybe rain check for a couple minutes later. So I just wanted to kind of like close, or not close, but add to that discussion a little bit onto how we are talking about challenging this idea of like the origin of trajectory, and just like how Ansaldúa and Moraga's work do this, like from tension, from the split, from the border comes knowledge. And so it's like, it's a very linear depiction of how we theorize about the border, about Chicano identity. And what I think that Herrera does that is valuable is that it gives us a through, a trans, like a trans border versus from here to there. So there is knowledge created in the through, which doesn't necessarily evoke a starting point or an ending point, in a way that Ansaldúa's from to does, and which challenges temporality in a way that I think is critical to decolonization, because if we are going to ever move toward decolonization, then that would mean that we would challenge temporality, in that we would value knowledge that we don't consider modern as much as we value today's knowledge. So I think that challenges in temporality are actually inherent of decolonization.
I think that also circles back to Lily, your reminder of what we do when we try to set aside an exclusive thinking of the border as a metaphor and decolonization as an aspiration, rather than something that we can imagine as a genuine, concrete political destination that we are actively working towards in this moment. Yeah. Alejandro and I invite you to speak perhaps briefly, and anyone else who wants to jump in. We officially have just a couple more minutes, though, as I've said, I think it's really clear that these conversations are going to continue beyond, are going to exceed the boundaries of our time and place, to pick up some of the language of this afternoon. So Alejandro and anyone else who might like to briefly offer some closing reflections.
Yeah, just for me, Herrera's list of words he doesn't use is really interesting to me, because sort of, and again, I think it goes in this idea of not necessarily looking to decolonize the narrative, or not necessarily looking to change anything in the border, because it's more about discovering and keeping certain things hidden so the metaphor still works in a certain way. And I think this is a challenge that a lot of us as creatives and literary critics and come into, because as much as we like the love of these type of metaphors and these types of language and these texts that have so much things going on at the same time, I don't know if it's conflicting or a barrier, or at the same time is helpful, but I don't know. I think when Professor Wong mentioned this idea of decolonization and decolonizing the border, it made me think of a lot of these questions of in which ways the metaphor is actually helpful, in which ways it might be detrimental, and in which ways it's beyond that. It's just another aspect of the border, both physically and imaginary, and in this way that we cannot think of the border just as a space, we can also not think of the border in a specific temporal time, in a regular present, past, and future. It's and I mean, I could go on, but I think that's sort of how I want to close out, with more confusing thoughts for everyone.
the border as a kind of aporia, or yeah. David.
Fernanda, is that hand up from before or?
Oh, I apologize.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just taking up Professor Middens on taking him to town with the narco literature thing. But
Do you need to take him to town more before we close out?
oh, it's actually not even that bad. It's actually just a quick comment. I don't know if you have read Yuri Herrera's other book, Kingdom Cons. And so in the interview that he does about that, I based most of my research for this on interviews just because I didn't really like the discussions that were going on like academically with a science proceeding. But in one part, he says, the words I refused to use in Kingdom Cons included Mexico, United States border, drugs, and narco trafficking. And that wasn't enough to avoid being called a writer of narco novels. In Kingdom Cons, the nucleus is a relationship. In my next novel, the nucleus is the experience of a journey. The rest is language. So it's just, I think that because these scenarios and these relationships and these journeys have very specific manifestations on the border, it's kind of hard for him to like escape them. And so in a way, if he wants to write about a relationship on the border, it might include a narco, but that doesn't necessarily like make it about a narco, which I think in the same way he writes about a journey, and on the border, a journey may mean border crossing, but it doesn't mean it's about border crossing, is what I would say.
That's really helpful and a particularly, I think, useful point to have made in these kind of closing moments of our discussion. Thank you. Thank you so much. David.
I don't need to say much more than what Fernando just says, because I agree completely. The narcos are there, which is also what makes it not a noir. Dussert says about noir that it's always that in noir life is elsewhere, including across the border, where people escape. They always want to escape from the law to go to Mexico because they'll be safe there. And so I think Herrera's point is precisely that it is there. There is no elsewhere. Everything that's there is there. It's how you represent it. The narcos are neither bad nor good. They simply are, and they're a network and infrastructure that Makina uses, that she makes use of, and that's part of her world. So that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of thinking about it. So thank you all.
Thank you all. This has been, as Anita has noted in the chat, an extraordinarily productive and generative and complex and dialogical. I mean, in ways entirely fitting to the source material, to the insights that these papers and the papers throughout the day have brought to this novel. And yes, I don't know, Jeff, if you have any further closing remarks, but allow me to just offer my thanks and my gratitude for allowing me to be present to these ideas.
So I'll offer a couple quick, sort of notes in passing. All of the discussions that we've had today should appear hopefully by tonight on the AU LIT's YouTube channel, just like all of these presentations were. This will be archived with all of them as well. Thank you to Professor Brideoake and Professor Vasquez for moderating as well, and for everyone for participating. There were very few people who came to session 2, where we actually were discussing actual art. I have to talk Professor Pike and Professor Wilson, I think, into this, because they're really the ones in charge. But there is actually a painting that's created by one of the panelists, who I'm hoping that we can exhibit that work in the Lit Lounge. I'm thinking, I did not even realize that was going on with Kai Tomlinson's presentation, that it's about his own art. And it's fascinating and like really, Alejandro, I'm sorry that you're not here to actually to actually see it, but I want to see it in person.
Yes, please. Yep.
Yeah. And for those of you who are writing papers, those of you who are presenting for Lit 311, congratulations, your work is done. For those of you who are writing papers, your job begins now, and taking all of these particular pieces as the starting off point for the work that you'll be doing over the next few weeks. Thank you once again. Look in the spring, everyone, as we pick a new text for next year. I will not be submitting anything this time. So, so something new will come in.
But this is our chance to thank you, Jeff, for putting this together and for all the work that you put into it. So thank you. This has been amazing. Yeah, and good to see those of you that are distant.
Absolutely. Yeah. Alejandro, it's not the same to walk into the Lit Lounge without you there.
Yeah, I miss you all too.
Take care, everyone.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Stay well. Take care, all.